Hi, and welcome to this video. A few years ago, I put together a Git video using Eclipse. And this time, I'd like to talk more generally about Git and show an implementation that uses IntelliJ. There's really not very much difference between the Eclipse and the IntelliJ, or if you're using NetBeans or something else, there's not that much of a difference. But I want to give you a little more foundation when it comes to version control and Git, and then talk about how to use them. So let's start with just a little bit of a conversation about version control and Git. Git is it's really an industry standard when it comes to version control. Git is about 10 years old, but over the last 10 or 15 years, it's become the industry standard. We went from CVS to Subversion, and then now we're at Git as the most commonly used repository for version control. So it's available on all platforms. It's available in pretty much any integrated development environment that you're going to have. You might have to download a plugin or something like that, but in many cases nowadays, because it has become the de facto standard, you're not going to find that. If there's a criticism of Git, it is that it can be kind of hard to understand and to learn. The power of Git is amazing, even though it's very simple when it comes to the commands and such. And it's a very fast and a very versatile and flexible repository. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the pieces that make up Git. The first piece is some kind of a repository that is usually remote. So examples of this kind of out there in the public are GitHub or Bitbucket, which is the one I'm kind of showing you here. It doesn't matter which of those you use. The repository is basically the same. If you're working in a corporate environment, you may use a corporate version of these, like Bitbucket is very commonly used in a corporate environment, but there are others. Git is native to Linux, and so if you're using a Linux environment, it comes with Git. But it's very common, if you're going to be sharing code among a team, to have some kind of a server-based repository. But on top of that server-based repository, you always have a local repository. And so that's sometimes the first step that a student misses. So in order to kind of set up Git, you've got to have a few things. You've got to have that server-based repository that's set up. You've got to have Git in your environment. So I'm using a Mac, and so I've got to have Git on my Mac. You can do the same thing with Windows and so forth. And then you've got to create yourself a local repository for Git and set up a relationship between that local repository and the remote server-based repository. And then in your integrated development environment, you're basically just communicating between the IDE and the local repository. And the local repository handles everything with it and the remote or server-based one. So I know that's a lot to sink in, but let's just go through a real quick example. I'm here at Atlassian, which makes Bitbucket. They have a nice little piece here about using Git. Installing Git. I didn't have to install Git on my Mac. It came with a decent version of Git, so I didn't really have to worry about it. But if you don't, or if you have a Windows machine, you might need to install it. Here's an install version of Git. What you can do is if you just go to a command prompt and type git version, it'll tell you whether it exists or not. If it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, then you might need to install it. So that's something to kind of get started with. The second thing that you need to do is to create your local repository. And I've already done this. I set up a repository called Git. And so basically I set up a folder called Git, and then I went to that folder and I issued a command, git init, and hit enter. Of course, this is after you've installed Git. And this sets up this folder as a repository for Git. Now you can you can use this repository to communicate with GitHub or Bitbucket or a corporate repository or whatever it may be, and they can intermix. So within my Git repository, then I have a series of folders that represent different repositories that are out on the server side. So I'm going to show you two different ways to approach this, because we often come at it from two different angles, and it can be difficult if you're reading information about how to set it up from one angle versus the other. The first is I'm going to start a completely brand new repository with no files, no nothing. And then the second way that we're going to approach it is I'm going to set up I'm going to have a project that's in IntelliJ that we're going to then connect up to the repository. So let's start with the first one, and we're just going to start brand new. So I've got here my repository. I signed up for this free repository through Bitbucket. I'm going to add a new repository, so I hit the little plus sign here. Repository is what I want to create. I'm going to name it something. I'm just going to call it my test repository, or let's say empty. Obviously it won't be, I gotta spell it right, huh? There we go. And I'm gonna create it. Notice I'm choosing here Git. For GitHub, I don't think you have that same option, since you can only create a Git version. So there's nothing in my repository, and if I click on any of these pages, they basically show the same thing, which is how to connect to my repository. So this is my server-based, what we call a remote repository. So I am going to, I've created the repository here, and so the next thing that I'm going to do is I am going to what we call clone the repository. So when we clone the repository, what that means is we're going to take this remote or server-based repository and we're going to make a copy of it locally that we can use. And as a part of that cloning process, we create this link or connection between the local and remote repositories. So it's really quite easy. I'm going to say git clone, and then I need to put in, if you notice here, git clone is already in this URL. Because of where I'm at here, I have to use the SSH version, but actually I think I can use the HTTP one for directly in on the Mac. So whoops, don't want to have it say it twice here. Oops, kind of muffing this up. Try it again. All right, and enter. And it's just let me know, hey, by the way, this thing doesn't have anything in it, just so you know. So I've got myself a cloned repository here. So I'm going to now go into an IntelliJ and create a new project. Let's see, just so you can see it here. And I'm going to, here's my project name. When this created, this project, by the way, we called it, what did we call it? Empty repository. So I'm going to call this the same thing. And actually, if I do that, I think it'll create, yeah. So let's see what happens. All right, so, sorry, this jumps around. All right, so I've got myself a project here, and it's connected up with my remote repository. Now, what happens here is, I'm going to click on this. This is only really for IntelliJ. I'm going to click on the project and come up here to FVC and just make sure that it's integrated. If it wasn't integrated, it would say enable version control integration or something. So it's already connected up. So I've got my project in IntelliJ connected to my local Git repository, and the local Git repository is connected to the remote or server-side repository. So let's try this out a little bit. The first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm going to right-click on my project. I'm going to come down here to Git. I'm going to add or commit directory, and here are a bunch of new files that it added. I'm just going to select all those. And then I'm going to say initial add, and I'm going to commit right here. Okay, so that you understand, if I'm adding a new file, I would go through these steps. I would put the file in, I'd add the file in my project. I would typically right-click on the file, select Git, and add the file. Then I would go in and commit the file, and then the last thing I do is I push the file. Pushing the file pushes it up to the remote repository, okay? So I did 2 steps in one here because it was the first time. I just committed this whole directory, which actually did an add and a commit. Now the next thing I need to do is a push, and that's down here on the repository, push. So you notice the initial add, this is the commit right here, and I'm going to push it. You could have done multiple commits, changes, adds, whatever, multiple commits, and then push all at once. It's a good idea to do them one at a time. All right, so let's take a look now. We're going to look at our commits here on our little project. You see we have our initial add, commit. If I click here on this commit, you'll see that it has the exact changes that have happened. It added all these files, blah, blah, blah. If I look at source code, you see it's set up here. I don't have a source file yet or anything really because I don't have anything in it, but this represents a project. I would then come in here and create a class, or I always like to start with a package, edu, and inside the package, put a class file, my class. I think I have 100 of those called my class. Yeah, we want to add this. And so I'm just going to do it as that. So, okay, I've added a new file. Up here at the repository, I come down to Get, I say add. Okay, I probably need to do it right here. Get, add. All right, and then at the repository, I'm going to commit the directory, say added my class, commit, and then git repository push. So right now, I'm adding everything to master. There's a master branch, and I'm adding everything to master, and that's fine to do it this way. If you have more than one person working on a project, you might want to create a new branch and make your changes to the branch, and then you merge the branch back into the master as part of pushing and committing it. So, but with this really simple scenario, we're just going straight line, committing back to master. All right, so this is a scenario where we have created the repository before we created the project. So let's start with and go the other direction, all right? So let's continue on now with an example where we already have the project existing in IntelliJ, and we need to get it into our repository. So I've got IntelliJ up here, and we're going to create a new project. We could also import a project if you had another project in NetBeans or somewhere else in a file system or whatever. But we're just going to be really clean here and create a simple project. I'm going to call this started repository. Notice the project location is within our Git repository. So we've created it here, and it's in IntelliJ, but it's not anywhere else. So we're going to that might be a problem. We'll figure that out here in a minute. Okay, we're going to go to the remote, and we're going to create a repository. We're going to call it started. Yes, I have tried this a couple of times to make sure it worked right. I might have created the name wrong. Oh, that looks like. All right, let's go back to our local repository. You notice now we've got a project here called started repository. This is where we saved our IntelliJ project. If I CD over there, you can see that it's got the initial files. So the first thing that we need to do is make sure that Git knows that this is a Git repository folder, not just a folder that's hanging out there. So the first thing we're going to do is say git init, and it initializes this folder or repository. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to connect this local repository to the remote one. And we do that by using git remote add origin, and then I'm going to take the repository URL here, make sure you're not using the git clone section of it, and I'm going to paste it here. And now I've connected this repository folder with the remote. So now if we go back to our started repository, you notice there's a git option right here. So right now we have an empty repository, or at least the one here that's remote, okay? So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to do an add, and we're going to do a commit, and we're going to do, oh, it doesn't give us that option. All right, let's make a change here. I'm going to add a source file. Let's call it. I'm going to create a package. Inside the package, I'm going to create a class. Can't seem to type today or click today. And yeah, we're going to add it. Okay, I'm not going to do anything else there. Let's go back to get and add and commit. Now there is something here for us to commit. I'm going to commit it. Now we get a message. Edit my class file. Commit. And we're going to push. Push again is going to push our committed changes back out to the remote repository. So we have, if we come back to the remote and we look at commit here, we see our first commit. If we look at it, we have our my class file here. So from a source standpoint, we've got that file. Now it's interesting that this one here didn't end up going. I'm going to give this one a shot and add it and commit this file. Put added. If you notice that there's something that didn't get committed, then definitely let's do something about it. I'm going to take this folder and I'm going to, for some reason this one didn't get committed either. Commit, add idea folder, and then I'm going to push this again. And this has the 2 commits in it because I did them 2 as separate files. Now, if I come back to my commits, I can see all of them. If I come to my source code here, I've got all my source code. So I'm not sure why it went the way it did, but again, the key here is to remember that when I'm creating a project, or I have a project that already exists, is that I first need to go to my local repository. I might have to initialize it and say, hey, this is a Git repository. Then I use the remote command, so git remote, to add the connection between the local and the remote after I've created my remote repository. And when you come back into your project, you should find that it's already, it knows that it's a Git repository automatically, and I should be able to do all of the Git kind of stuff that I need to do. So hopefully this has helped you when it comes to understanding Git a little bit better. It can be definitely a tricky application to work with, but with a little bit of testing, just make a bunch of test projects and see what happens. Just play around with it a little bit, and you'll find that it's not quite so hard to work through.